Hello, and welcome to None of the Above. This is the exciting week of the year in July when the Aspen Institute is meeting, and we get to cherry pick, I don't know if that's the right word, cherry pick great speakers from the Ideas Fest, and we always want to thank them for allowing us access to their guests. And it allows me to go outside the box a little. You know, the show is normally about why the political system is dysfunctional and polarized and how we're going to fix that. And when the Aspen Institute hits, I like to work on the edges of this. And I saw a topic that was basically described as philanthropy, democracy, and justice. And I didn't know much about it, but it intrigued me. And I thought this is a good topic to, you know, go a little bit outside the box and get to the fringes. So I contacted Professor Rob Reich from Stanford. He was gracious enough to agree to be on the show today. And I've since read his book, Philanthropy in Democratic Societies, Philanthropy in Democratic Societies. And I have to tell you that I have never been so fascinated while preparing for an interview. And I have been working with this huge onion all week, and I've been peeling back layer after layer after layer of this onion. And Rob has made me think. I may have to go to Stanford and take his class now just to dig into this. In fact, I feel like I've been preparing for the final exam all week. So anyway, without further ado, Professor Rob Reich from Stanford, and we're going to talk about philanthropy in a way you've never thought about philanthropy before. So, okay. Rob, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you come to Aspen, the world of philanthropy. Everybody here fights about who gives the most money to somebody,
yeah.
And you have shaken them to the core. So how did you get into this arena?
Right. Well, I guess the first thing to mention is that by training, I'm a political philosopher. So I'm inclined to think philosophically. I wasn't, at least in the first instance, looking around and seeing what foundations do or what charitable organizations do, and a bunch of questions came to me. I was thinking about some philosophical questions about how a democratic society should be organized and what counts for a healthy democracy as opposed to an unhealthy democracy. And then before I went to graduate school, I had been a public school teacher for a couple of years, and I was familiar with all kinds of things concerning public education, which, in my view, is an essential feature of a healthy democracy. And then when I was living in the Bay Area, and I had kids who were becoming school-aged, I began paying more attention to the local school environment. And what I found in the Palo Alto area was something that surprised me, which was there were a number of local school foundations or very high operating PTAs and PTOs that were collecting charitable or philanthropic contributions from parents in the local community, going to the public school system to supplement the public dollars that funded public education with philanthropic dollars. And I thought to myself, well, on the one hand, this is generous. Parents are supporting the public school system, which is oftentimes thought to be insufficiently funded. And they always have the alternative of going to private school, and this is something they're supporting the public school, so that's a good thing. On the other hand, I also thought, as someone who cared about equality of opportunity, that the Palo Altos and Aspens of the world could raise a lot more money philanthropically for public schools than poor neighborhoods or big cities could, so that the philanthropy that supported Palo Alto schools or the philanthropy that supports Aspen schools is going to make worse the funding inequalities between wealthy places and poor places. So I thought to myself, that's maybe something to write about. So I began researching how much money Palo Alto raises for the schools. And you can tell me, does Aspen have a school foundation?
I was just going to say, full disclosure, I was on the board of
great.
the school
Well, I'm going to tell
foundation.
you why what you were doing wasn't such a great idea.
I'm not on the board now. So
okay, great.
No. I know you're going to tell me. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You're shaking things up here.
Well, okay, so this phenomenon, philanthropic fundraising for public schools, because, of course, it works out that wealthy towns can raise much more money philanthropically than poor towns can, is a classic example of something I found shocking, which is you think that charity has something to do with providing for the needs of people who are disadvantaged or providing for support for the poor. And here is a perfect example of philanthropy that makes worse inequalities and that supports the already wealthy people in the country. And then when I came to that realization, I thought to myself, well, how exactly does this whole system of philanthropy and charity work? And I realized that local school foundations, if you were on the board of it, you know this, they're 501c3 nonprofits. So when parents make a donation to their own kid's school, they get a tax deduction for that. So the federal government is subsidizing the worsening of an inequality that I thought schools should be working to overcome. So I thought to myself, well, why are local school foundations, 501c3 nonprofits offering tax deductions to their donors when it's making the inequality worse, not better? And I thought, well, now I've got a different topic. It's not just about local school foundations. It's about how often does charity worsen inequality rather than make it better? And then I started learning about foundations rather than just individual donors. And I thought to myself, well, no, this is not just a small op-ed I was going to write. I have a much bigger topic now. I'm going to explore the topic of the role that philanthropy plays in a democratic society and the public policy framework that helps manage it. Why do we have nonprofit organizations and for-profit organizations? That's not a natural law about the world. Those are legal creations. The private foundation, when did that start? How did that come about? Carnegie and Rockefeller, is that an example of pure generosity, or is there something else going on there? And so, just as an ordinary scholar would, I began poking around some of these questions, and that eventually came out. The book you just showed is the conclusion of the research.
And what's interesting, I guess, is you have developed this area of research, and you have a cohort that's working with you.
Right.
But until you did this, it really wasn't something else that had caught on.
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, no one really been asking many questions about, what you could call the political theory of philanthropy, or how to understand not what role philanthropy actually plays in society now, but what role philanthropy should play in a democratic society. I don't think people have been asking too many questions about that. The way I often, begin a conversation about the topic with people who, want to know what the conclusions of the research are, I tend to start by saying, the conventional attitude that citizens have, or that anyone has towards philanthropy in the United States, is that we should be grateful to people who make charitable and philanthropic contributions because they don't need to do so. It's a voluntary thing. They're other regarding or altruistically oriented, and of course that's something that's praiseworthy. And even if it turns out that the charitable contribution someone makes or the grant that a foundation makes turns out to be money that's wasted, has no good impact in the world, well, at least that would have been better than the wealthy person just keeping the money for him or herself and buying, another house or a fourth car and, just doing more private consumption. So that even if philanthropy turns out to be ineffective, it's still better than private consumption. And that's the attitude which I want to try to sweep aside. I think that's a misguided attitude. And the reason is the following. Especially when you think about the work of big philanthropy or foundations, people who have a lot of resources that they're directing philanthropically. Philanthropy is an exercise of power. It's an attempt to convert private wealth into public influence. Public influence that has some social benefit, to be sure, but still it's the donor-directed preference of creating some social benefit, not a democratically and collectively decided manner of producing social benefits. And so if you, Stephen, were a philanthropist and you said, well, I have some great ideas about how to make the schools better, I might say, okay, maybe they are good ideas, but you're trying to use your private wealth to have a public effect. And I think I want to just describe that in a simple way of you're trying to exercise some power. Now, power is ubiquitous, but power, especially if it's concentrated power with very large donors, is something that deserves scrutiny, not gratitude, or at least not only gratitude. So I actually went back in history then and looked at the creation of the Rockefeller Foundation, which, when it was set up, encountered fierce criticism from an enormous number of people, including the sitting president of the United States, senators in Congress, who felt that Rockefeller's money was earned in a foul manner. And so they were somewhat opposed to him personally. But there are also people who said things like, the very idea of a foundation is repugnant to the operation of a democracy. And the reason is, I think, that what a foundation represents is something like the standing invitation to wealthy people to insert their private preferences about how society should be organized into the public sphere. Or to put it more bluntly, perhaps, it's a standing invitation for plutocrats to operate in democracy. And when you layer on top of that some further observations about what a private foundation represents, foundations are mostly unaccountable. No one stands for election in the foundation. There's no competitors in a marketplace of foundations. When the Gates Foundation gives money away, there's no other foundation trying to block it out of the market. There's no consumer who can decide, I'm going to stop purchasing from the Gates Foundation. So foundations have very low accountability. They have low demands for transparency. They can operate under the radar. You don't have to have a website. You don't have to accept grant applications. You have to file a tax form every year with a minimal amount of information. So you've got philanthropy is an exercise of power. Philanthropy is largely unaccountable. Philanthropy can be non-transparent. And then the final thing, which I mentioned before, is it's not just the liberty of people to give their money away. There's tax subsidies that attach to it. So we provide tax subsidies to stimulate people to exercise a liberty they already possess. You or I could give a lot of money away and not take a tax break for it and have the same philanthropic effect in the world. So why does the IRS diminish the amount of tax revenue it collects in order to stimulate us to do something that's donor-directed, non-transparent, unaccountable, plutocratic in a democratic society? And I thought, the foundation sounds like a pretty bizarre thing now. And the orientation which I want to bring to the table is maybe it's appropriate to be grateful to people who are philanthropic, but it's also appropriate to be skeptical and to scrutinize their activities because they turn out to be exercises of power, largely unaccountable, non-transparent, tax-subsidized power. And that led to the book.
No, it's just fascinating. I keep peeling back, a layer of onion after layer. And let's stick on this side for a minute. This is the side of saying we need scrutiny. Maybe it's not always made out to be. There's problems here. Let's stick on that side for a minute, because let me tell you some layers of the onion I was thinking about.
Good.
So first of all, we had the issue last year with the Clinton campaign, and whether or not this, there's some impropriety there where it folds over to the political world and can create levels of inequality in terms of access to the political world.
Right.
Now, you don't cover that in your book, but have you started to study that element of this?
Right. I mean, there's a phenomenon of politicians, and it's not just presidential candidates or former presidents, but people in state legislatures or governorships or in U.S. Congress who either have foundations on the side or they work in nonprofits. And one mechanism for people to gain access to politicians and perhaps to exercise some influence over politicians is, rather than to show up and lobby them, you can decide, let's say you're the Clinton Foundation. This is what I assume you're trying to suggest. You're a foreign government, and you can donate money to the Clinton Global Initiative or the Clinton Foundation, show up at the annual gala, and you're seen to be in communication with the Clintons, and now around a charitable purpose, not a narrow self-interested purpose of trying to get the Clintons to do something.
And I got to deduct the contribution I made to be at that event.
That's
and
right.
I got to talk to the Clintons. And I don't want to pick on the Clintons here, but that's how it came up.
That's right.
But if I wanted to make a political contribution, I couldn't deduct it. And in fact, I couldn't discuss that contribution with them while I was talking to them about an issue, because that would be illegal.
Sure.
But when I move it over to the charitable world, and this came to the fore last year. And in my day job, my viewers know I'm a lobbyist, and I see this in a lot of what I do. And now you have organizations back in Illinois where I lobby. There's a Black caucus, there's a Latino caucus, there's a Women's caucus. Well, they now have set up 501c4s, educational entities, right? And then I'm getting calls from them, would you like to make a political contribution to my campaign? That's one call. But now I'm getting a call, how'd you like to contribute to the educational foundation that we've set up? So it's one way, more way for them to shake me down, but it's another way for, again, a lobbyist like me to get access. And I'm worried in the world of Citizens United, it's another way for these corporations to help fund what looks like an educational activity, and they're gaining political access.
Now,
so I don't want to get off on a total tangent. What I'm saying, that's a layer of an onion I'm peeling back.
I agree with everything you've just said, and I'd further describe it as a form of corruption of the charitable sector or the philanthropic universe. Corruption in the sense of introducing into the public's eye unnecessary questions about the background motivation of people who are donating for a charitable purpose. So I'm willing to assume, in fact, I think there's actually good evidence to suggest that the Clinton Foundation's initiatives are doing some genuine good in the world. So I'm not skeptical that the Clintons in their foundation activity are organized solely around their political futures. I think there's some good work being done. But it's nevertheless unfortunate that when people examine the activity of the Clinton Foundation, they have to wonder what the motivation is of a donor, whether it's to gain access to the Clintons for political purposes or to help support the activities of the foundation. So that's the form of corruption I'm talking about. Now, what I want to say about that further, though, is this represents a relatively small portion of the overall philanthropic universe, the people, the politicians who are setting these things up. So as these kinds of things come into the public eye, as reporters do stories about the Trump Foundation or the Clinton Foundation and raise questions in the eyes of ordinary citizens about, well, maybe foundations are a sort of scam. It's a way to do lobbying and to call yourself being a charitable person and get a tax deduction for it. Well, that colors the whole charitable sector. And although I count myself as a frequent critic of philanthropy, I don't think there's a zero place for philanthropy, and I think that the charitable sector does an enormous amount of good, and it would be distressing if it turned out that the kinds of corruption we're talking about in these political foundations meant that the work of an ordinary foundation or an ordinary charitable organization was seen by others as just another scam.
Yeah, I don't want to disparage their work, but I'm saying there's a layer here. Another layer of the onion I started thinking about is in your speech that I watched for the Ashman's Idea Festival, you anecdotally talk about Bill Gates and someone calling him the superintendent of education.
The nation's unelected school superintendent.
And then I'm thinking about Bill Gates. He's doing, again, amazing things, right? He's probably better known right now for his philanthropic work than he is for inventing all the computer technology.
Yep.
But one of his major causes is, I believe, he's in Africa trying to help cure diseases.
Right.
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 So another thing that's happening is he's getting a deduction. He puts the money in his foundation, and he's now not even taking care of schools per se, which is in the United States.
Right.
But he's moving his money outside the United States. So
Right.
another part of the conversation, perhaps, is, okay, you get to do great things, but should we be giving you a charitable deduction to do great things outside our country without debate and without transparency, without all the other things that should come with it?
Yeah, that's right. So I might get the details of this slightly wrong, but we could look this up and find exactly.
We will not hold it against you.
Okay, good. Okay. But you make a good point, and I think it's a question worth putting on the table directly. Just as you say, philanthropists can decide to direct their money overseas, or they can direct it in a domestic sense. And independent of where they direct it, they get a tax deduction, but a tax deduction from the standpoint of the IRS and the U.S. government. And so we as American citizens are collectively subsidizing the global philanthropy of people like Gates, and in a way which is not democratically accountable. So if I were a poor person in Seattle and I thought to myself, well, gee, here's this grand philanthropist and he's directing some enormous proportion of the money for the benefit of desperately poor people overseas, but what about me right next to him in Seattle? Don't we deserve a little bit? Well, if the Seattle city were directing its funds overseas, you could decide to unelect the mayor or the city council. Right. Or if the corporate philanthropy was deciding to direct the money overseas, you could decide, I'm going to stop buying the stuff that's made by this company. But what could a Seattle poor person do about Gates? What actually happened once was a whole bunch of poor people showed up and sat at the front door of the Gates Foundation headquarters to stage a small protest. You, Gates, should be giving more money to poor people in Seattle. And that's basically the only form of recourse, because the Gates Foundation is not accountable to its consumers. It doesn't have consumers. Right. It's not accountable to citizens, because it's not a democratically organized or accountable thing with elections. I sympathize with the poor person in Seattle who thinks Gates gets to decide who counts as a worthy beneficiary, and I have no say at all. Now, at the end of the day, I myself am mostly in support of Gates's own decision here. Namely, I think that the kind of leverage or benefit that a philanthropic dollar can provide globally is frequently larger than it is domestically. And so I'm, in general, a fan of global philanthropy. But that I still would have to have something to say to the poor person in Seattle. Right. And the poor person in Seattle doesn't have any recourse except going to sit in front of the Gates Foundation and saying, pay attention to me.
So I'll do one more layer of an onion, because we got to get to the other side, right? Because we got to stick up for the other side here. So then I'm thinking, and you said this in your show, someone said another anecdote was they would have been better off taking a big pile of money and burning it in their backyard than giving it to Stanford. They were making a point. Yeah. So here's my question. This goes to inequality. You know, Harvard gets a ton of money. Stanford gets a ton of money. Right. In my world, where I represent poor inner city hospitals, there's amazing hospitals in the city of Chicago. They're academic hospitals. They get all the money.
Right.
But the money isn't going to the poor schools and the poor hospitals. We don't have a mechanism that even suggests to them, all right, you want to give the health care, here's how we think it should go to health care. Or you want to give the education, here's how. All it does, as you said, it just kind of increases and exacerbates inequality at certain levels.
Right. Yeah, well, one of the things which I guess in the most charitable description you could describe as an irony is that whereas the the term philanthropy or the term charity suggests assistance for the disadvantaged. Often, in practice, philanthropy serves to amplify advantage or amplify inequality. And just as you described, the kinds of institutions, universities that I work at Stanford, it's one of the winners in the philanthropic collections, and is an extraordinarily well-resourced place that I'm super lucky to work at. And it's an interesting question to ask whether it makes sense for someone to make a donation to a place that has, I don't know what it is these days, $20 billion in the endowment, as opposed to giving it to a place that has no endowment at all. I have to say that I think there are some reasons why it makes sense to give money to a place like Stanford, and it has to do with the research production that goes on at Stanford that's then offered up as a public good for the world. But a lot of people don't think that universities' primary function is research. They think its primary function is teaching. And in that respect, I wish Stanford, as one of the winners of the philanthropic universe, would say we'd like donors to support public universities and less well-off universities too, or perhaps more generally, there might be public policies that help to shape donors' actual decisions. I mean, to give an example here, you might think that there should be a double tax deduction for giving to a place which serves primarily poor students, or to a hospital which has its chief function is charitable provision. Or get rid of the tax deduction entirely for giving to Stanford and only allow it for giving to places that primarily serve people who are poor. I mean, that's just an example of the sort of policy change you could imagine putting in place if you thought it's a real problem that the wealthy charitable organizations like Stanford, or a hospital which has super specialized services but doesn't provide much charity care, win even more philanthropy than the places that seem to need it more.
So today is clearly one of these days when I'm so sorry I cut my show for an hour and a half hour. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. Let's go to the other side, because you want to give the argument of why the goodness here and the virtue of this. So let's do that.
Okay. So I do in the end think that there's a really important function that foundations, big philanthropy, can play in a democracy. So I want to say there's lots of tensions that philanthropy represents with democracy. The philanthropy versus democracy frame is a good one, because philanthropy represents this plutocratic voice in democratic institutions. But I think there's ways that big philanthropy can serve democratic purposes, and so here's the explanation for that. One thing to recognize about philanthropy is that what seems initially as a vice, that it's largely unaccountable, can be turned into a certain type of virtue. Philanthropy has the permission to take a much longer time horizon in terms of stimulating successful or innovative or experimental policy initiatives.
They don't have to run for office in 2 years.
There's no one to stand for election, just as we were saying before. And in the marketplace, there's no consumer to put them out of business. So a philanthropist could say, look, I want to try doing something that I don't know if it's going to work. It might take 10 years for us to see any results. And the kind of experiment that I'm interested in funding philanthropically is not going to be carried out in the corporate world, because they don't have 10 years to figure out whether their investors are going to patiently wait.
Investors or people voting. Right.
Correct. Or your elected official is not going to wait 10 years because they got to stand for election in 2 years or 6 years, whatever it turns out to be. But in philanthropy, you can actually patiently take your time and try out a bunch of novel experimental things. Let's hope that a whole bunch of them actually will fail, because otherwise you're not being daring and risky enough. And having piloted a few experimentally interesting and, let's say, social scientifically tested, empirically validated new innovations, well, let's not be abstract anymore. Take the Carnegie creation of the library. Carnegie didn't say, when he said, I think public libraries are kind of good ideas, circulate knowledge. I'll offer philanthropic money to set them up anywhere who wants a public library, and I'll fund them in perpetuity. He didn't say that. He said, here's a bunch of money to try them out. And then, because no philanthropy, even the Gates Foundation, has the resources to fund what they've piloted at scale for every single person, they have to present it to the state legislature or the federal government, or in the case of the library system, oftentimes cities and towns. Well, what philanthropists can do is provide long time horizon experiments to humbly present the successful versions of those to either the marketplace or to a democratic public, as if these experiments are auditioning for a stamp of democratic approval. And if philanthropists do that, that serves democratic purposes rather than interferes with them.
Well, I'm glad we got to that side. I have a friend who's in the world of philanthropy at a very high level, and he's involved in the development of this whole world of the social impact bonds.
Right.
Just now. I think that's a good example of something that
Yep.
you couldn't get anywhere else
Right.
but through philanthropy and
Right.
then the marriage of government. And in that one, at least, you do have some discussion about where the money
Yeah.
should end up going.
Yeah.
So I like that part of it.
Yeah, yeah. Social impact bonds are an interesting experiment.
Yeah. So quickly, you've written this great book, and you've raised a lot of problems. Are you seeing discussion about this in places? More importantly, is there fomenting discussion in government? Are people starting to say, hey, Rob's onto something, we at least have to talk about it?
Well, the honest answer is I don't know.
Okay.
And
Well, if you don't know, I'm just because
right.
it's not happening.
But I mean, for better or for worse, I came to the question not because I thought to myself, well, I'm reading the tea leaves in Washington and how
Yeah.
Congress might do this or that. That's not how I started writing.
Right.
I was, for better or for worse, philosophically oriented about a question. Now, I'm interested in trying to bring this to the awareness of the people. That's why I'm here on the show and talking in a way that I'm probably reaching people that I wouldn't otherwise reach or be at the Aspen Ideas Festival. So I hope it turns out to be of interest to people in government, but time will tell.
You got my interest.
Yeah.
You're a great guest.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate
And,
you having me.
Again, for our viewers, we've been talking to Rob Reich. I want to say, you're not Reich, you're Reich. Rob Reich from Stanford, Philanthropy and Democratic Societies. It's an academic book. I mean, it's not an easy one, but it raises so many fascinating questions, and it does, at its own level, get to this dysfunction in government that we talk about because of the political aspects we talked about. So thanks for joining us. As always, we hope you were educated, and we hope you had fun. Remember, if you're not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. Thank you.